Now, I think it's safe to say many of you here at Hope are very familiar with what's generally thought of as social engineering. Our next presentation will take a deep dive into the subject, including some less familiar areas of social engineering. We present Robert W. Gale and Sean Lawson with a history of social engineering from mass to interpersonal to mass personal.
Hi, I'm Robert W. Gale. I'm a professor of communication here at Louisiana Tech University. I'm calling in from beautiful northern Louisiana.
And I'm Sean Lawson. I'm a professor of communication at the University of Utah, and I'm joining you all from sunny Salt Lake City. And today we're going to be talking about the work that we have been doing on the history of social engineering, which spans the histories of hacker social engineering, which we're sure you're all pretty familiar with, but also includes looking at the early influence industry, PR and propaganda, which we call mass social engineering, and spanning to more recent developments in what we call mass personal social engineering, which we will spend some time in the presentation defining and explaining for you. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob to get us going on the presentation, and we're going to switch over to slide view here, and you won't have to look at us anymore, which is probably a good thing. And then we'll be back with you at the end for questions and comments. So Rob, take it away.
Thanks, Sean.
As Sean mentioned, we're going to present a history of social engineering from mass to interpersonal to mass personal. Let's dive right in. On July 4th, 2017, a performance art flash mob appeared at the doorstep of the White House in Washington, D.C. And they were there to protest the presidency of Donald Trump. They wore American Revolution-inspired costumes and sang songs from Les Miserables. The event was well attended, in large part because the Facebook advertising was sponsored by none other than the Russian government. Specifically, the Internet Research Agency, now famous for its meddling in various Western elections. The IRA spent $80 on Facebook ads to promote the anti-Trump rally. According to Nina Jinkowitz, the people organizing the rally got Facebook messages from one Helen Christopherson, who claimed to be from South Carolina, who offered to buy the advertising. The only catch was Helen would have to become the administrator of the rally's event page. Helen was granted admin status in exchange for $80 of Facebook ads. Of course, Helen wasn't really Helen. She was a fake persona concocted in St. Petersburg, Russia. The benefits of the $80 of Facebook advertising to the rally planners weren't negligible. Estimates show that the ad reached roughly 50,000 people in the D.C. metro area. But the benefits to the IRA were many. Contacts with the anti-Trump resistance in Washington, D.C., Facebook data on U.S. anti-Trump activists, and sowing continued chaos in American political life. Of course, the Russian government's sponsorship of an anti-Trump rally came only months after the IRA worked to support the candidacy of Donald Trump for president. Pro-Trump, anti-Trump, the work of the IRA is all chaos, all the time. These Russian operations are eerily familiar to anyone versed in the history of information warfare, yet they're taking on strange new shapes in the digital age. Thus, we need to find ways to understand the Russian operation, label its practices, and grapple with them. There have been a lot of names for these activities. Fake news, lie machines, trolling, disinformation, misinformation, and cyber war. There's one term that we think captures what happened with the Russian IRA far better than any other. It's one that has the flexibility to account for the interpersonal dynamics of the Russian operation, as well as the IRA's ambitions to affect society on a mass scale. And it's a term many of you are quite familiar with. The term is social engineering. We're not the first ones to think of the Russian operation in this way. Kevin Mitnick, for example, referred to the Russian operation as social engineering, particularly in relation to the hack of John Podesta of the Democratic National Committee. Security researcher Thomas Rid referred to it as political engineering, social engineering on a strategic level. Another security researcher, Megan Kim, gave a talk at B-Sides in Philadelphia where she explained why it's useful to frame Russian information operations as large-scale social engineering. Hacker social engineers would immediately recognize the Helen Christopherson Facebook event takeover as social engineering, gaining trust, offering a gift, and getting administrative access to a social media page. It comports the security consultant Sharon Kanhidi's definition. Social engineering involves convincing people to perform actions they would not normally do. That's exactly what the IRA did with the anti-Trump protesters. They got the rally planners to give away administrative access to their events page, and in doing so, the rally planners gave away valuable information to the Internet Research Agency. Indeed, these tactics have a long history dating back to the phone freaks of the 1970s, who would social engineer operators into giving them access to restricted parts of the Bell telephone system. Pictured here are Bob Gudgel, J.D. Pritchard, and John Captain Crunch Draper in 1971. People like Denny Teresi would call up an operator, pretend to be a fellow employee, gain the operator's trust, and then get access to special phone company systems. He might call up an operator, for example, and pretend to be a fellow employee needing access to special test lines that might allow him to do a telephone conference or break into other people's phones. This is an interpersonal con directed at one person, in this case, an operator. Phone freak social engineering translated quite easily to later hacker practices. In the 1980s, Kevin Mitnick and Susie Thunder, pictured here, used social engineering to con passwords out of people or to get access to networked computers. Hackers do the same thing to this day, often via email, but also over the phone or even in person. But in this presentation, we want to take a wider scope than just phone freak and hacker social engineering. We want to read the Russian operation through the lens of another group of people who call themselves social engineers, the creators of public relations and mass media propaganda in the early 20th century. These engineers of consent, Ivy Lee, Edward Bernays, and Doris Fleischman, saw themselves as elite masters of crowds. They felt that their duty was to convince the masses through media messages. They did their work at mass scale, targeting society as a whole. Their form of social engineering appears in the 1890s and reached its apogee in the 1920s to 1950s. Like other forms of engineering, the conception here is simple. Let's take the principles uncovered by the new social sciences, things like sociology, economics, psychology, and apply them to social problems. They drew on these social sciences to shape society via newspaper, radio, or movies. For example, in 1934, Doris Fleischman called for a dictatorship of women's fashions in the United States to manage women's tastes with engineering exactness. It could be carried out so the various techniques of propaganda might be more efficient. Fleischman's PR partner and husband, Edward Bernays, also builds on this idea. His essay, The Engineering of Consent, published in 1947, is especially relevant because it focuses on the new mass media to elaborate techniques of social control. It's worth spending a bit of time on this particular essay by Bernays. As Bernays argues, today's leaders, with the aid of technicians in the field who have specialized in utilizing the channels of communication, have been able to accomplish purposefully and scientifically what we have termed the engineering of consent. He goes on, words, sounds, and pictures accomplish little unless they are the tools of a soundly thought-out plan and carefully organized methods. If the plans are well formulated and the proper use is made of them, the ideas conveyed by the words will become part and parcel of the people themselves. We see here in Bernays' plans the application of the new social sciences to society. This is analogous to the application of scientific principles to physical engineering. Much as an engineer would take scientific principles of physics and apply it to bridge building, the mass social engineer would take the truths of social science and implement them, perhaps even injecting them as with a hypodermic needle, into the consciousness of people. The vision is modernist, progressive, rational, and objective. It targets masses, the people, crowds, groups, mass communication, and mass psychology. Mass social engineers had a vision as grand as that of their counterparts in civil engineering, perhaps even grander. Whereas the civil engineer could shape a landscape with a bridge, dam, or canal, the mass social engineer would shape society as a whole, rationalizing it, ridding it of crime and class and racial conflict, purifying it, making it moral, making it efficient, and improved. So social engineering has two meanings handed down to us from over the past century. An interpersonal manipulation of targets, often over the phone, email, or even in person, and an older meaning of shaping society through mass media. Because social engineering carries these two meanings, hacker con artistry and mass media propaganda, we find it to be an excellent way to think about the Russian operation. In fact, we suggest the Russian operation weaves together both meanings of social engineering into a third form we're calling mass personal social engineering. We see mass personal social engineering as the manipulation of individuals, like the freaks and hackers did, but with the goal of affecting society as a whole, like the mass social engineers. If we had to reduce this to a specific communication technology, it would be corporate social media, with its affordances for what some scholars are calling mass personal communication. The mass engineers use newspaper and radio, and of course the phone freaks love telephones. Today, social engineering is happening on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Sean and I are writing a book for MIT Press about mass personal social engineering titled Social Engineering: How Crowd Masters, Freaks, Hackers, and Trolls Created a New Form of Manipulative Communication. And to show how mass personal social engineering works, we're going to draw heavily on the idea of hacker social engineers. Why would we do this? Well, this is because hacker social engineers have developed a language for what they do that is brutally honest. And the concepts they use are sophisticated and eye-opening. We find the language of hacker social engineers to be intellectually rich. For example, in a bulletin board message in 1993, Legion of Doom member Mentor explained social engineering this way. For those of you who may be new, engineering is short for social engineering, which is long for bullshitting. Now, our impulse as academics might be to reject this term bullshitting. It sounds crude, it doesn't sound scholarly. But as we will show, philosophers have taken the idea of bullshit very seriously, and we will too. So our presentation is a history of social engineering, but instead of telling our history in a year-by-year fashion, we will divide it up using the phone freak and hacker social engineering concepts: trashing, pretexting, bullshitting, and penetrating. We'll use these concepts to better understand both mass social engineering of the early 20th century and the Russian operation of the early 21st century. So let's start with the trash. The first thing social engineers do is gather information on their targets. These days we might call this OSINT, open source intelligence, and use Google Dorks or social media searches. Back in the day of the mass social engineers like Bernays and Fleischmann and Lee, they would talk about collecting facts about their publics. This could include basic demographic data or information collected through surveys. But the phone freaks and early hackers had a very provocative term: trashing or dumpster diving. Phone freaks and later computer hackers discovered that phone companies and corporations threw away valuable information: manuals that explain corporate jargon, organizational charts, even network structures and passwords. The idea of going through corporate trash was extended into the digital realm. An article in 2600 in 1984 suggested if you build a crosstalk amplifier, you can hear a lot in the electronic garbage heap of telephone signals. Suppose one day you hear the crosstalk of a modem conversation. You could record it and decipher it. And computer hackers share techniques of going through memory dumps. In her testimony to the U.S. Senate in 1983, Susie Thunder referred to this as garbology, which is another fascinating term. So we like the freak hacker term trashing because it implies going through things that people have thrown out, things that are overlooked, things that are forgotten. It captures the same act we do when we do research on the internet. We see this logic in contemporary interpersonal hacker social engineering use of data dumps or OSINT research. As for mass social engineers of the early 20th century, they talked about similar things back in the 1940s, suggesting that advertising engineers should go through a household's empty packages, that is, their trash, in order to learn what people are consuming. As for Russian interference in Western democracies, one example of trashing included going through abandoned Hillary Clinton staffer email accounts. As the Associated Press reported in 2017, operatives with Fancy Bear began testing old Hillary Clinton campaign staff emails. One of the first emails they tried was for a staffer named Rahul Srinivasan. His email had been unused for nearly a decade. Like many of us might do, he threw it away when that part of his career was over. It took several waves of working through similar discarded email addresses that were known to be registered with HillaryClinton.com's domain before the Fancy Bear team found active email accounts, narrowed their list of targets, and eventually spoofed John Podesta into clicking on a malicious link. Like the trash bins behind the phone company, the internet itself is a digital dumpster, containing out-of-date and discarded information that has to be sifted through in order to glean enough to refine an attack. So now let's turn to pretexting. After going through the trash, a social engineer has to come up with a role to play, a pretext. The classic pretext for the phone freaks was, of course, playing the role of a line repair person calling from the top of a telephone pole. A more recent example might be pretexting as a doctor. We're unfortunately living with a global pandemic, and doctors are trusted figures. Want people to trust you? Maybe you should get to eBay and buy a doctor's lab coat. It's important to note that social engineering pretexts often exploit racial and cultural stereotypes. As social engineer Chris Hadnagy puts it, the goal of the social engineer is to get you to make a decision without thinking. And a way to get your target to not think is to have pretexts that play to existing stereotypes, including racial, gender, sexual, or class stereotypes. For example, Sharon Kanhidi notes that the pretexts available to her, since she presents as a petite woman, include cleaner, teacher, or waitress or caterer. She notes she has trouble when she plays a role of IT support, even though she knows a lot about computers. When she pretexts as IT support and wanders around a building, people come up to her and ask her if she's lost. Much as I hate it, she says, you play to stereotypes. This can include things like accents. These days, social engineers might use an Indian accent or hire someone to do this, to play the role of tech support over the phone. In the 1990s, they might have used a Japanese accent, as Kevin Mitnick did. Mass social engineers also play to stereotypes. In fact, the concept of the stereotype was developed during their day. Edward Bernays talked about stereotypes extensively, arguing, we all have stereotypes which minimize not only our thinking habits, but also the ordinary routine of life. He argued that the mass social engineers needed to take advantage of such stereotypes. The PR team of Bernays and Fleischman worked for the American Tobacco Company, with the goal of increasing smoking among women. They used stereotypical images of thin women and associated thinness with smoking. Reach for lucky instead of a sweet was the slogan. Unlike hacker social engineers, though, mass social engineers like Bernays and Fleischman did not perform their own pretexts. Instead, they used proxies like a group of high society women in New York City who were convinced to throw a green ball in 1929 to promote green as a fashionable color. What Bernays and Fleischman failed to mention was that the green ball was covertly sponsored by American Tobacco, and the goal was to ensure that women would find the green packaging of Lucky Strikes to be fashionable. As for the research on Russian mass personal social engineering, it shows that they use multiple pretexts, including Black Lives Matter and Texas gun rights activists. We already saw at the beginning of this talk how the Russians used the pretext of anti-Trump activist after Trump won. And the goal of all these pretexts, Black Lives Matter, Texas gun activists, anti-Trumpers, was to amplify existing social roles and debates in order to create more divisiveness in the United States. The Russians tapped into existing stereotypes in American society with their pretexts. In the specific case of pretexting as Black Americans, the Russian operation was bent on suppressing the vote, discouraging Black Americans from voting since the system is stacked against them. According to the 2019 State of Black America report, Russian propagandists specifically targeted African Americans through a wide-reaching influence campaign. Their tactics included posing as legitimate activist groups, eroding trust in democratic institutions, and spreading disinformation. Of course, one of the major concerns about the Russian mass personal social engineering operation was that it could be done at a large scale. The use of automated social bots in Twitter, for example, has gotten a lot of attention. In a study on the use of Twitter bots during a recent election in Sweden, researchers found that a large proportion of accounts discussing the election exhibited bot-like behavior, and the researchers argued that they were likely controlled from Russia. Controlling a major proportion of an online political conversation is pretexting on a mass scale. However, research on the Russian operation also found that they built interpersonal relationships online. The connection between Helen Christopherson and the anti-Trump ralliers is but one example. This is more akin to spear phishing than the larger scale of approach to using bots. And now I'm going to turn things over to Sean, who's going to continue the presentation.
As for bullshitting, recall the mentor's definition of social engineering as a way of saying bullshitting. Bullshitting is arguably the core practice of social engineering, and the concept of bullshitting is a very rich one. After background research and coming up with a pretext, the social engineer has to engage with the target, and this is where bullshitting comes into play. Bullshitting is, in fact, the more common term for freak and hacker social engineering, especially in the late 1970s through 1980s. Zines like TAP and 2600, as well as Underground Bulletin Board Service Post, included articles on how to bullshit effectively. We mentioned that we find hacker social engineering terms to be intellectually rich and insightful, and bullshitting is probably the best example. We define bullshitting as a creative mix of deception, accuracy, and friendliness. We get this definition from two key theorists who, like freaks and hackers, see the conceptual importance of the word bullshit. To define bullshitting, most people turn to an important book of philosophy, Harry Frankfurt's On Bullshit, published in 1986. In it, he distinguishes bullshitting from lying. Lying is predicated on knowing the truth and telling the opposite. To lie, a liar needs to know the truth. Bullshitters, on the other hand, are indifferent to the truth. The bullshitter does not know and does not care about the truth. Keep in mind that this does not mean there is no role for accuracy or facts. After all, if social engineers have no regard for any facts, why dig through garbage or pore over social network feeds or try to come up with realistic scenarios? They want their pretext to be as plausible as possible, so they will learn jargon, dress authentically, speak in the proper cadence, or write in a tone that makes their pretext believable. In other words, they do it to try to get things right. But facts or accurate statements are grabbed as needed and mixed with other statements that are plausible but may or may not be true. Second, we turn to an essay by communication scholar Chandra Mukherjee, Bullshitting, Road Lore Among Hitchhikers, which takes up another common meaning of bullshitting, as in shooting the bull, bull session, shooting the shit, or friendly sociable talk. Mukherjee, like Frankfurt, found that truth was less important among hitchhikers who were telling road stories. Instead, she argues, bullshitters are playful and sociable. Creating community is their goal. But being friendly is not just about kindness. It helps manage perceptions of others. The playfulness is meant to be plausible so the bullshitter can maintain their social status. Thus, our analysis combines Frankfurt's conception of bullshitting as indifference to truth, a sort of instrumental series of statements that mix deception and accuracy, with Mukherjee's emphasis on friendliness and sociability. This can be seen in an example of phone freak bullshitting provided at the First Hope in 1994. And we encourage you to watch the video. The link is provided on the slide here. In this scenario, SN called up Sprint in order to get a customer name and address number, a number that only Sprint employees should have. And in doing so, he bullshits very well. He mixes deception, claiming to be Bob Dwyer from Sprint Social Engineering, with accuracy, using the lingo CIS, TS, CN/A, and he's very friendly and kind to his fellow employee while doing it. Unlike the freaks, the mass social engineers did not often use the word bullshitting. Perhaps using the term would reveal too much about their work. There is one example that we have seen, however, of folks from this era of social engineering using a variant of the term. In 2010, John Martin Campbell recounted his time as an Air Force psychological warfare officer during the Korean War in his memoir titled Slinging the Bull in Korea, An Adventure in Psychological Warfare. He recounts that when he arrived in Boise, Idaho for training in 1951, a sign posted outside the squadron headquarters included a picture of a snorting bull with a caption that read in Spanish, "The bull is mightier than the bullet." The caption reflected the belief at the time that carefully chosen words, whether presented as promises or propaganda, would often prove as powerful as bullets. Campbell explained that the first requirement in leaflet production was to tell the truth, or at least the truth as the Army saw it. Campbell is an exception, however. Most of the mass social engineers never publicly called their work bullshitting. But whether they used that term or not, the mass social engineers definitely engaged in bullshitting. So, for example, in 1914, Ivy Lee was hired by the Rockefeller family, who were facing bad publicity because of mining operations they owned violently put down a strike in Colorado with paid strikebreakers. The strikebreakers shot union members and burned their tents. Several children who were hiding under a tent were killed. We now call this event the Ludlow Massacre. Lee worked to smear the union using bullshitting. He mixed deception, claiming the union leaders were paid much more than other union members and that the union started the battle. He used accuracy, sharing facts about Colorado coal and its role in the national economy. And he did his work in a cheerful and generous manner as he smeared the Union. Russian mass personal social engineers also bullshit. That they deceived people is now obvious. They were definitely not Black Lives Matter activists or gun-owning Texans. This is why we're hearing so much about the Russian operation being fake or being lies. However, we think that simply calling the Russian operation a bunch of lies misses what they did. They didn't lie, they bullshitted. Reports on their operation note that they tried to get things right, particularly the language and politics of the American groups that they were targeting. And they were friendly, playing games with people that they engaged with, sharing inspirational images, and being kind. So one example from a U.S. Congress commissioned report illustrates this. Here's a collection of Texas-themed memes that the Russians shared on social media. And there's a lot of bullshit here. We have fake statistics about how successful Russia would be if it seceded from the United States. We have, of course, images of Texas. And this includes images of Texas wildflowers and wildlife. So here we see a mix of deception, accuracy, and friendliness. This is, quite frankly, bullshit. And as the phone freaks and hackers taught us, bullshit containing all these elements is very effective for social engineering. Finally, let's turn to penetrating. Again, we reach for a hacker term to understand social engineering in all its forms. Professional hacker social engineers now often refer to themselves as penetration testers or pen testers. And pen testing is, of course, a job where organizations hire social engineers to test their security. Pen testers might use phishing or in-person engagements, and any security holes they find ought to be written up in a professional report and, of course, reported to the client. Their goal is relatively clear: access or penetrate a system or organization. But despite being professionals, we can still rely on hackers to tell the honest truth. I just want to F you up, says Jason Street at DEF CON 19. I just want to mess you up in the worst possible way. I want to be the worst thing to ever happen to you at the worst possible time. Street is presenting his approach to penetration testing. He has stolen purses, laptops, even cars, all while being paid to do so. His viciousness, his talk is titled "Steal Everything, Kill Everyone, Cause Total Financial Ruin," is not prurient, however, but rather is in service to a greater goal of security. Pen testers like Street aren't doing this for fun, but for our benefit. As Sharon Conhede puts it, remember, once you are a social engineer, you deceive, manipulate, and trick people for a living, but you also educate them. And social engineers are very successful at deceiving and manipulating for good. So, when asked how many buildings she's penetrated, Jenny Radcliffe coyly responds, "Too many to say." This perspective that we break security in order to improve it, that our skills are superior, and that we are inevitably getting in, reflect the elitism of hacker social engineering. We're getting in, say the pen testers, but we're doing this for your own good. We're effing you up to help you. The mixture of elitism and social engineering for our own good also appears among mass social engineers. Recall Doris Fleischman's call for a dictatorship of fashion, where elites would simply tell women what to wear. Likewise, Ivy Lee held similar views, arguing that the crowd craves leadership. If it does not get intelligent leadership, it is going to take fallacious leadership. We know that the leadership which the mob has often received, not only in this country but in other countries, unless corrected, is liable to produce disastrous consequences. And Edward Bernays mounted a defense of propaganda in democratic societies in his famous 1928 book, Propaganda. The mass social engineers also used the language of penetration. Specifically, they sought to penetrate media markets, media systems, and ultimately news coverage. Success for them was defined in terms of numbers of newspapers covering events, how many news stories, and letters to the editor. Here is the front page of the April 1st, 1929 New York Times, a paper that Bernays and Fleischman were excited to see because it mentioned a media event that they created, getting young women to smoke in an Easter parade. It's the highlighted story on the left. We even have penetration ideas from the mass social engineers. The hypodermic or magic bullet vision of communication, where the right message given at the right time can affect the behavior of masses. This is a conception of communication as a form of penetration, in this case, the mind rather than a computer, and it's still quite implicit in contemporary thinking today. So, like ethical hacker social engineers, the mass social engineers also saw what they were doing as using elite knowledge for public good. Bernays, Fleischmann, and Lee all saw themselves as social elites who were in service to leaders in industry and government. They saw their job as controlling the unruly masses who would, if left to their own devices, destroy society. Only through the beneficent control of mass social engineers could we enjoy life in America to its fullest. Once again, let's take this hacker social engineering term, penetrating, and consider the newest social engineering, mass personal social engineering. We see in the IRA operation a mixture of the interpersonal hacker form of penetration and the mass social engineering form of market penetration and manipulation. The scale and scope of the operation was large, and many researchers measure it in terms of social media metrics, so likes, shares, follows, impressions, etc. But it also at times relied on the more precise, almost individualized targeting that the surveillance of social network activity increasingly allows. So we shouldn't forget then that the IRA et al. Got individuals to take real-world actions. A key example is the organization of 2 competing protests at an Islamic center in Houston, Texas. Of course, the big question about IRA interference in Western elections is, were they effective? Did they penetrate societies such as America with their messages? The debate about whether or not they affected the 2016 election is still raging. This is similar to the long-standing debates over the effectiveness of mass social engineering. And the fact of the matter is, measuring such effects is very hard to do even to this day. But one thing is for certain. The Russian ability to sow chaos in American society is part of a larger Russian mission of maintaining its global position as a superpower. And this is where we turn to the beneficial aspects of Russian interference, at least from the Russian point of view. They F us up for the good of the world, which is the truth, at least as they see it. And they see their ability to interfere in Western democratic processes as an indication of their own elite prowess. With these hacker social engineering concepts, trashing, pretexting, bullshitting, and penetrating, in mind, as we consider them at scale, we start to add complexity to our understanding of the Russian operation to sow chaos in Western democracies. It makes sense, we suggest, to call these efforts social engineering because it echoes the older mass social engineering of the 1920s, as well as the newer hacker social engineering of the 1970s onward. We would suggest that the process of mass personal social engineering includes research culled from digital sources, including overlooked digital information, pretexts based on social media profiles. These can be done at mass scale via automation or in a more interpersonal approach with human-controlled accounts. The deception, accuracy, and friendliness of bullshitting. And finally, ambitions to penetrate media systems or debates with a goal of shaping a target population's opinions and actions. And so with that, we thank you for your time, and we are going to be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that you might want to make.
This is A History of Social Engineering with Robert W. Gale and Sean Lawson. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'd like to invite those of you attending Hope to ask Robert and Sean your questions. Please post them to the live stream Q&A channel in our Matrix chat, and they will be relayed here. We have a question from the audience, which is, are are we destined to repeat history?
In terms of, I'm assuming upcoming election, my guess is, yeah, it hasn't, not much has changed in that regard. A lot of the studies of the efforts by the IRA and et al. Show that they're ramping up their efforts even after the election of 2016.
And we have another question. A member of the audience asks, how can we tell if a bot-generated tweet changed a mind?
It's kind of an interesting loop we're in, because I actually asked that question because we were having a conversation in Matrix about the talk yesterday about the effectiveness of social bots, and the researcher presented at Michael yesterday suggested that social bots weren't particularly effective. The problem is I don't know how you measure the effectiveness of something like a social bot changing a mind. I'm not sure, because there's no experimental isolated group we could work with, and it's very hard to crawl inside people's minds and figure out what they're thinking and if a tweet changed a mind. And I think Sean has a lot to say about this, because he's kind of concerned about the industry that's producing a lot of these discourses and purporting or claiming to try and shape political debates.
Yeah, so I'm not quite as concerned about, an individual bot changing an individual mind, right? I don't know that you're ever really going to be able to measure that, and I don't know that that's really happening so much. I think the pathway by which perhaps minds are changed is probably more in the aggregate and over time, and that's going to be also a difficult thing to sort of measure. But I also think that there's a lot more to mass personal social engineering than just the automated Twitter bots that we have all heard about. I think it's a thing that people really focus in on because, it doesn't really even take a lot of training to be able to go out and start uncovering bots and finding accounts that are obviously bots, and then, seeing who are they following, who are they retweeting, what hashtags are they using, and start, putting together those pretty colorful network graphs that individuals and different organizations put together and publish online. And so that all seems really sexy and cool, but I'm not sure that the bots are the thing that is really as worrisome to me. What's more worrisome to me are the kinds of techniques you see deployed by groups like Cambridge Analytica, for example. And again, there's a debate around whether or not those techniques actually worked or not. I think there's a much better argument to be made that those techniques had a higher chance of potentially having an effect than the bots. And those techniques, of course, revolve around, collecting lots of data about all of us online, and then essentially weaponizing that data back against us in terms of being able to micro-target against us individually or in very, very small segmented groups that can then be targeted in key locations to try to change their behaviors just enough to change actions and behaviors in the real world. So for me, that's the more concerning thing than the bots.
Yeah. Another member of the audience asks, any advice on what you think we can do to counter this?
Well, one of the security researchers that I talked to, or actually somebody working in security, said something that really provoked thinking along these lines. And he said, I'm a knowledge worker, but I don't have time to think. And one of the things that we talk about constantly is the speed of information flowing over the networks and all the things that we have to juggle all the time as part of our work if we're working with information. And I think that's an environment that's really ripe for social engineering of all these different types. So if I could wave a magic wand, I want to slow down media, to be honest with you. And I don't think that's going to happen. But that seems like one of the, maybe there's a way to put together a media system that's just simply more slow and thoughtful than the system that we're kind of subjecting ourselves to these days.
Yeah, I mean, I also think, and I suspect a lot of folks in this crowd already do these sorts of things. And this is where I sometimes go more towards individualized solutions, like what you can do as an individual. And Rob has a tendency more to talk about systemic level issues like the media system. But I think just good OPSEC, good personal OPSEC on all of our parts could go a long way in helping, right? Like reducing the amount of information that you're putting out there about yourself. Because that information that you're putting out there, that's the digital garbage that we're all leaving behind, that the bad guys, whether it's a hacker social engineer that wants to come along and get into our email or get into our computers, is using. And it's the same kind of digital garbage that the Cambridge Analyticas and the Russian trolls of the world are potentially aggregating and using to target us individually or in small segments to try to manipulate, elections and manipulate behavior in the real world. So, be careful what you're putting out there about yourself.
Yeah, and this is one of the debates that Sean and I are constantly having, because in my view, that puts way too much pressure on each individual person to defend themselves. And so we need to think about aggregate solutions about data protection at, nation state or global level. And probably we need to mix both.
Right. I agree. Yeah, we need both. I mean, we really absolutely have to have systemic and structural change ultimately to address these issues. But in the meantime, I think we all have to take care of ourselves as best that we can.
Another member of the audience asks, they say, I enjoyed your characterization of Bernays and Fleischman. My question is whether this directly fed into the history of advertising, i.e. thinking back to the early days of television. Is that a logical arrow of evolution to follow?
It's part of the story, yeah. But Bernays and Fleischman, Lee, saw advertising as one of the tools in the toolbox, but they did some really innovative things to, as Bernays would put it, kind of shape the social environment of people. And so one of the things that we mentioned in the talk is the green ball, which wasn't an advertisement per se. It was Bernays and Fleischman encouraging a bunch of high society women in New York to basically make green the fashionable color of the year. And that was all in service to American Tobacco, which was trying to promote Lucky Strike cigarettes, which came in this green packaging. And they were trying to encourage more women to smoke. So getting people to think green was fashionable, and therefore I could carry this package of cigarettes around and it matches my, outfit, was a goal that they put forward. And they did get media coverage. And so that's not really an advertisement. And to use the language that we're picking up, it's a pretext, which I think is a distinction or a distinct entity from advertising.
We are asked, are all levels of interaction compromised? There's interpersonal, mass media, but is there something else like communal media in some form?
I'm looking at you, Sean.
Oh man, I don't know. I thought this is where you're going to give a pitch for like Mastodon or alternative social media. That's your hobby horse lately.
Yes, it is. Yes, I definitely recommend leaving corporate social media for the alternatives.
I mean, I don't know. In my case, in my own, and I guess this gets back to the individualized solutions and responses versus systemic. In my own personal case, I mostly try to follow people that I vet, myself, and I try to make sure like they're real people and they're legit. And I usually, I take all the folks that I interact with and I put them in categories. I put them in lists. So like if you go and look at my Twitter profile, you'll see that I follow quite a lot of people. I'm pretty generous in terms of if people follow me, I usually follow them back if they look, halfway legitimate at all. But the only ones I actually see content from are really the people that I sort of curate out into different topical lists. And those are the folks that I really pay attention to. Because, I'm sort of paranoid about, being one of those people that falls for some trick and I retweet something that was, bullshit, right? And then everyone's like, haha, you have a PhD, but you retweeted this thing from a bot or whatever, right? So I'm like, I don't want to be that guy. And so, I mean, I guess, yeah, like that's one way to deal with it on an individual level. If you're worried about interactions being compromised, is just try to have fewer interactions and narrow the scope of the content that you're consuming, the people that you're following and that you're interacting with. I mean, we could probably all do with slower media, as Rob said, and probably, a smaller stream of information that is coming at us, from the fire hose every day. We're all going to be okay if we don't have, as many tweets and Facebook posts and garbage being thrown at us every day. and if we're a little more careful in terms of like curating our sources and paying attention to what it is we're consuming and what it is that we're sharing.
Talking of the stream of garbage that's thrown at us, someone asks, can quasi-real-time third-party fact-checkers bring back trust in random media? Could that be the future?
Actually, there's a lot we can learn from the history here. So if we go back to the mass social engineering period, so, turn of the century, 1900 through 1940s, around that time, the progressive movement was really interested in what they muckraking journalism. And the basic idea was, let's collect facts about, say, this large corporation, this monopoly. We'll present the facts to the public, and the public will become outraged and want to regulate that company or rein it in somehow. And that got picked up very quickly by the mass social engineers, who said, all we're doing is dealing in facts, but we're giving the facts as basically our patrons want them presented. And so I don't know if facts are the antidote, because I think when we look at bullshitting, the term we're taking seriously here, it's a mixture of facts and deception and friendliness in such a way that it's very, very convincing and almost overrides an interest in facts, or just pure information in that sense.
A member of the audience asks, how do we protect or inform the average person who does not know that this is happening to them, and they fall for it, and then they believe it, and now their minds are even harder to change?
Yeah, a lot of people are working on this. How do you deal to take up a conspiracy theory, like a conspiracy theory about a global pandemic, for example? And a lot of the research shows that you can't just simply, again, throw facts at somebody and say, look at all this, how could you be taken in by this? How could you be duped? You almost have to take on their mindset for a while, think about the conspiracy theory, think about why it's attractive to that person, and then slowly kind of chip away at it. So it's not a matter of just simply throwing information at people. It's really meeting with them and doing the hard work of that kind of interaction and debate, discussion. It's something that, at least in the US, we seem to be shying away from. When family comes to visit, we're told, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, and so on. Maybe we have to talk more.
I think, another idea I have had, and I don't know if this would work or not. I guess this would be a thing for, some of our more social science kind of colleagues to test out in more of an experimental kind of setting. But it seems to me that, if you talk to some people about the bullshit that maybe they have fallen for online, they get very defensive, right? Because they don't want to believe that they have been duped and that, they got fooled and maybe they're helping to perpetuate a lie. But I think if you talk to people about how, there are large companies like Facebook and Google, or there are shadowy sort of marketing companies like Cambridge Analytica, which is a subsidiary of a foreign defense contractor, and hey, look what they're doing in our election, that would upset a lot of people, regardless of what they believe in their own sort of personal political beliefs. I think a lot of people would be upset about the idea that there are hidden forces or there are nefarious actors that are trying to manipulate you behind the scenes, that are using your information against you to try to that's the angle to talking with people, not necessarily going after the bullshit that they believe, but trying to educate them about the fact that you have to be very careful because there are all of these companies and nefarious actors out there, honestly, throughout the whole spectrum, the whole political spectrum at this point, that are trying to manipulate and cajole and push us maybe in directions that we wouldn't otherwise go on our own. And so people might be a little more receptive to that kind of message than the message that says, hey, you got duped and you're an idiot because of it.
I want to quickly plug Aylin Poret's talk yesterday at 11 Eastern was really good in that regard. It did a lot of what Sean was saying. And I thought that was really effective, and that I encourage people to look at that video.
Okay, great. And we'll have to leave it there because we're just about out of time. This has been A History of Social Engineering with Robert W. Gale and Sean Lawson. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.